Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf Pei Zion 87 of Batra. We are talking about how one acquires movable objects. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. So yesterday we concluded with a statement by Rav and Shmuel that if a seller says that they're selling 30 for $30, then until all 30 are measured out, the parties can retract the transaction. On the other hand, if the seller says 30 for $30 and one for $1, then as each unit is measured, so then the parties cannot retract that unit. So we attempted to challenge this once, but that challenge was rejected. And as we pick up at the end of the second line from the bottom of Pei Vav Amud Bet 86b, we're going to offer another challenge. Tashma, near the end of the line, end of the second to last line. Tashma, hasocher es hapoel asos imo lagorin. If you hire somebody in hayom bedinar, and you agree to pay him 1 dinar per day. And let's take a look at Rashbam. Rashbam helps us clarify the situation. Second to last line, hasocher es hapoel, v'nosin lo schoro ashav, and you pay him now. So we're gonna b'Nisan, and the next word of the Rashbam is in Nisan. So that is in the springtime. You pay him in the springtime, at the beginning of the harvest season. In the beginning of the I guess it's the earliest of the harvests. In order to work for you on the threshing floor. Well, the threshing isn't done until the end of the summer, until now. And so now, several months later, you're hiring him. He's going to do the work, but you paid him all in advance. And then Hayom Bedinar, and then continuing on in the Rashbam, Kolomar Kol Yom Shal Yamosa Goren, every day that he's going to work in the threshing on the threshing floor or at the granary. So then bedinar, and you're going to pay him every day at the dinar, a dinar. V'nasan lo akshav lamed dinar l'lamed yemei hagorin, and you pay him now 30 dinar for the 30 days, and you gave it to him all the way back in Nisan. And now, as we turn to the Pei Zion Amud Aleph, v'legoren yafa sela. But listen to what happened. The guy made a bad deal, because how much was the work worth? How much would it have cost you to hire somebody to work in the granary and on the threshing floor in Tishrei when he eventually does the work, or in Av, or a couple months later when it's time to start working in the granary floor. So that it will go in Yafa. It was worth a sella. A sella is 4 dinar. So he should have gotten paid quadruple what he was going to get paid. Asr lahanosi mena. You're not allowed, the hirer, the employer is not allowed to benefit from this wage deal that he made. So even though
he's taking the loss.
No, he's taking the gain, right? He agreed to pay 1 dinar, but now it's worth 4 dinar to him, right? Because he's the hirer. Right. The employee working would have cost, he paid the guy 30 dinar for 30 days. If he were to hire him now, it would cost 30 sella, which is 120 dinar. Right. So why is it that it's prohibited? So Rashbam explains why it's asur. If we take a look at the second line on Pei Zion Amud Aleph, asur mishum demechse ki agar naterli. It looks like pay me for waiting, right? So the point is that you're not allowed to paying for waiting for me is, I guess, what the agar, a payment, natar li, is to wait for me. So the point is that the worker is effectively paying back a 30 dinar loan with 120 dinar. So that difference looks like interest. Exactly. Looks like interest, which is ribis and prohibited. Exactly. Shenosin lo zeha poel sela v'yamot gorin, because the worker is paying back every day a sela in the days of the threshing. B'shvil dinar shenatan lo b'nisan, for the dinar that was given to him back in Nisan. V'hamtin lo ad akshav, and the point is that the employer needed to wait until now, and so it looks like a repayment of interest. Aval im scharo me'hayom. However, the brisa continues. If I hired you today and I paid you 100 dinar starting today to work from today through the threshing floor, well then, bedinar liyom, vilagoran yafasela, and now, even though later, 3 months later, it's worth a sela for every day, mutter, then it's permitted. And Rashbam explains, aval im scharo me'ayom, last of the wide lines at the top of Rashbam, me'ya yom b'me'ya dinar. If I pay 100 dinar for 100 days, v'nasan lo scharo achshav, and I pay him all up front. I pay you, the worker, Stan, all up front. V'lagorin ha'yachol lehistaker ha'poel b'sela, and of course, 90 days later, you realize, oh my gosh, I could have gotten paid for sela for today. Dahainu arba dinarim, which is a sela for today, which is 4 dinarim layom. Kevan sheme'oto hayom shescharo osa imo, because we started all the way, the work that you did for me all the way back at the beginning, mutter. It's permitted. Shekol peulas hameya yamim kiyom echad oroch. It's that the 100 days that you work for me, it's like one long unit, one long day. Damyan, it's comparable to. V'lo havi agar natarli, and therefore it is not a payment for waiting for me. Shaharei miyad hitcha b'pu'ulato, because Stan, you began your work immediately. Ukemoshe hitcha b'pu'ulas yemei hagorin dami, and so it's as if we made the deal in the days of the threshing, and that would be permitted. Meaning the following: if in fact, let's say you could go work for Ken for a sela, meaning 4 dinar per day, and you choose to continue to work for me, and you could choose instead to be hired by me. Maybe I'm closer, etc. Whatever the reason is, you decide to be hired. That's permitted. You're allowed to charge less for the work that you do, and we'll see that more clearly inside. And so as a result, that's the point here. The point is that when it's permitted. Now, so what's the question? So the question is the following. Listen, well, let's take a look. The Gemara now highlights the question. Now, if you think, remember the statement that we made at the end of the day yesterday is 30 for $30 is you can retract the transaction, but 30 for $30 and 1 for $1, so you cannot retract the transaction for any of the dollars that have happened, for any of the units as the units get picked. So that if I say that I'm going to sell you a core for 30 and a sela and for each sela, rishon kana, that you acquire each one individually. So what's the understanding of that? The point is that everybody agrees that we can stop at any point. Well, hachanami. So here in this case, kama mifsak pasuk, each separate day should be its own entity. So when Rashbam said that in fact we can treat all 100 days as a single unit, that seems to contradict our statement that says that 30, when you say 30 sella for a core, one sella for a saw, then that each day is viewed individually, that each unit is viewed individually. So therefore, you should be prohibited to continue to, I should be prohibited to have you continue to work for me, even if I started having you work for me on day one, because every day should be viewed individually. And so as a result, day 90, when you should be paid 4 dinar, you're still being paid 1. And I paid you that dinar all the way back in Nisan. And now it's, Av or Tishrei or whatever. And so as a result, you should be able to say, I can't do this work for you, because if I do this work for you, it's like I'm paying you interest. So what, shouldn't that be prohibited? So hakinami kama misa pasak va'azar la'anozi mena midinner layom v'lagorin yafis sela mutter. And yet we said in this brisa that a dinner per day, that if I say how much it is on a unit basis, and yet the work, when you do it in at the end of the year on the threshing floor, it's worth a sela, and yet it's permitted. Amai v'ha agar natar lihu. It should be a reward for waiting for me. So amarava v'tizbara. 1 second, you want to say that, does that really make sense? Because listen, zilzuli b'schiros mi aser. Did anyone forbid charging too little for the work that you do? Let's take a look at Rashbam v'tizbara. It's right opposite Perish HaRashbam HaIkari on the right-hand side of the page on the daf that I'm looking at. It's about midway down in the narrow lines of the Rashbam. V'tizbara Dilahavi Aser. Does it make sense to say that it's prohibited? V'chi zilzuli b'schiris mi aser bitmia. Is the question is, did hiring yourself out for too little, is that prohibited? Of course not. It's not prohibited. So even though I, the employer, paid you early the dinar min Nisan, and in Nisan, the lo asa imo ad lagoren, and you did not actually work until the threshing time. Mid oraisa shari, from the Torah, this is all permitted. De lo dummy lo lahova v'lo lamekach umemkar de is beona. This is neither a case of a loan, nor is it a case of you selling me something for too little, which would be ona. I can't take advantage of you to pay even a sixth less than the actual price should be. So as a result, it's not either of those, because ubitel mekach, and therefore it should be a nullified transaction. Dahasam, because in this case of a worker, badai ki mozil gabe michte shavio bishvil hakdamas hamos. Because in those situations, it's definitely making things cheaper in order to, because of the early payment. Nimsa, we see. Shenosin lo yoter mikidei hadamim. And when the person pays back, he's paying back more than the amount of the money, shekibel, that he accepted. Aval schar tircho, but when it comes to payment for work, shall adam, of the person, leka agar natali. There is no concept of wait and pay me for waiting. The derech poel lahaskir atzmo b'kol shehu, because workers will hire themselves for any amount, kisha lo ma'yochel, when they don't have something to eat. The kol masha mekabel hapoel mibalabayis, and anything that the worker gets paid from the homeowner, revachu, it's profit etzlo for him. V'hilkach hach seifa leikat sad ribis klal. So when we have the latter case where there is no waiting for day one of the working that's being done, there's not even appearance of ribis. V'hainu de kaparich maishna reisho maishna seifa. And we're about to ask, What's the difference between the Reisha and the Seifa? Kaven dil zilzuli bischirus shari Reisha. So what the question is that once we say that you can make your work less expensive, we should also say that the first case should be permitted. Amai usur. So why is it prohibited lahanos mimenu, to benefit from him? So let's take a look now at this back inside the Gemara. And
What's
so
the first case?
what? Sorry.
So when you said, I'm getting confused between the first and second case.
All right. So the first case is where the employee was hired for the future and did not start work immediately, and now in the future, the amount that he should get hired for went up. So in that situation, we say it's prohibited because it looks like a payment of interest, because the payment, the work being done is repayment for the money that was given early. And the second case is where the worker begins work immediately. And so as a result, there is no delay in, now, of course, there's a delay in the sense that the work that's eventually being done on the threshing floor in the threshing season is being done at a cheaper price. But because the worker began working immediately, there's no appearance, even though I paid all up front, there's no appearance of there's not the same degree of an appearance of being cheap, of interest. So
But you
what
could pay up front in both cases, right?
you pay up front in both cases, but the difference is does the worker start work immediately? In the second case, he starts work immediately, and so that's why doesn't appear that there's any waiting. It's like he's beginning to pay back immediately, and so therefore there's no it's all okay. And of course, it's not actually a repayment of a loan. It's all actually a business transaction of a payment for work. So now the Gemara is asking the question, what's the difference between the first case and the second case? 8th line down on Pezayin Amid Aleph, first words on the line. Maishna Reisha, Maishna Seifa. What's the difference between the two cases? Why is it, and as Rashbam explained, why is it that the first case is prohibited? After all, it's just a business transaction. And in a business transaction, you're allowed to sell something, to sell your work for less than it's actually worth, or less than you could get elsewhere. Reisha deloka avid bahadi mahashta. So in the first case, because the worker didn't begin work immediately, mechse ki agar natarli. It looks like it's not that it's actually reward for waiting for me, but it looks like a reward for waiting for me, that the employee is paying back to the employer. So seifa, but in the latter case, the ka'avid bahadi hashta, when he works for him right now, lo machzika agar natarli, it does not have the same appearance of waiting for me. And so that is why that is going to be permitted. And again, why do we bring all this is not to teach us a law of paying interest and how it applies to workers, etc. The point is that we had said that if you sell 30 for 30 and 30 for $30, and you mention one for $1, then every unit gets viewed as its own transaction. So maybe we should also say that when I say I'm paying you 100 for 100 days and $1 for every day, so then, and now at the end of the time period, the work that you're doing for me is worth $4 per day. So maybe we should say, let's ignore all the days that you worked for me and view independently the day at the end, and say that there too, it's as if I paid you at the beginning and you're paying me back later, and it should be prohibited, even though you worked throughout. And the bottom line is that we treat work and payment for work different than both a sale transaction and a borrowing transaction and a loan. In both a sale and a loan transaction, if I give the money early, there's a loan component to it, and we are going to be concerned about you paying back too much. But when it's an employment transaction, we don't have that concern. Certainly that concern isn't a biblical concern, and the rabbinic concern would only exist if in fact you make me wait for the work that you're doing. So that was that piece, and now we've resolved that. And so in the end, we say if you buy 30 for 30, and that's all the person says, you need to, until the 30th unit gets weighed out, you are not liable for the transaction is not completed, and either party can go back on it. On the other hand, if the person says 30 for $30 and 1 for $1, then as each unit gets weighed out, you are on the hook both ways. Both the seller's on the hook to keep the transaction and give the item to the buyer, and the buyer's on the hook to pay for the transaction. Okay.
But with the case of the laborer here, doesn't he get ultimate? Wait, when he gets paid at the beginning, right?
Correct. He gets paid at the beginning.
So, but you said if the price is greater at the end for the dinar for the
correct. If even though he got paid at the beginning $1 for the work on day 95, that work on day 95, if I were to go and try and find an employee other than Stan, I would have to pay $4 for that work. So the Gemara, so in the first case where I had to wait for him all the 94 days until he actually worked on day 95, that looks like he's paying me back more than I gave him. And so we're going to say it's prohibited rabbinically. On the other hand, if he's worked for me all 94 days, well, then it's all part of the single transaction, and therefore we're going to say that it's permitted.
He's paying me back with his
labor.
For his labor because
I paid him on day 1.
So he's not working that period of time. So he's paying him back because he could have done something else. It's free time for him. Is that the way we're seeing it?
Well, that's the way. That's the Hava Amina. The Hava Amina is that this is really just a loan. I gave him $1 back in Nissan, and now that it's well, we can even say today, now that it's Elul, right? And we're it's a threshing time. So now he's paying me back by doing work for me. Now the work that he does for me is actually worth $4. So isn't it? So that's the problem. That's the question. When is that permitted and when is it prohibited? And is it prohibited as doraisa a ribbis or not? And in the end, we say, no, it's only prohibited rabbinically if there was waiting involved. And when there's no waiting, it's permitted.
Oh, so it's paying, the waiting time is considered paying back because he's.
No, the waiting time is waiting. I don't understand. The waiting is.
No, I'm just, but I don't understand the statement that the worker is paying back the employer. I'm trying to figure out in what context. So waiting.
Well, because look, if I gave him $1 and I gave him that $1 in Nissan for work that he's going to do for me in Elul, so he either owes me my $1 back or he owes me work, and so the work is instead of paying me my $1 back.
Right.
That's what we're talking about. Okay. All right. So now the Mishnah that we cited yesterday referenced, or maybe 2 days ago, referenced flax. That if a small amount was actually maybe even 3 days ago, that the flax was attached to the ground or more. The flax was attached to the ground, and I uprooted as the buyer a small amount. So I've acquired all of the flax, not just the one that I pulled out of the ground, but all the flax that's attached to the ground. So the Gemara asks a very logical question. Mishum de talash kolshahu kana? 1 second. Because I took out of the ground a small amount, I am now acquired all of it? How could that possibly be? So Amar Rav Sheshes, Hachabamayaskinen. Here's what we're talking about. De Amarle. Lech yape lecha karka kolshahu uknei kol masha aleha. If the seller, if Stan, who's the seller, says to me, listen, go improve a little bit of the land, and through doing that, you will acquire everything that's on the land. So Rashbam and Tosfos offer 2 different explanations for how this works. Let's take a look at Rashbam first. First of the widest lines of the Rashbam. Lech v'yafe lecha karka kolshahu. Kach kasav b'sfarim yishanim. This is what's written in the old Sfarim. Kolomar That meaning that's the language that the Gemara should have. And again, that's the language that we actually have in our Gemara. Kilomer, lech v'chazek b'karka. Go make a chazaka in the karka. To go do an acquisition act on the land. Liknos pishtan hamachubarba. In order for you to acquire the flax that is attached to the land. De karka nikna b'chazaka. Because we have a general rule that land can be acquired with a chazaka, with an act of ownership. The kol hamachubar lakarka harehu kakarka, and anything that's attached to the ground is like the ground. So va'asa masnisin lashmeinan. So our Mishnah is coming to teach us the chezkas karka, that a chazaka on the land, mahani lepishtan, will help us acquire the pishtan that's attached to the land. Va'afal giagam delo zabin le'ara, even though you aren't buying the land. So what is Rashbam saying? Rashbam is saying that, listen, the way you can acquire the wheat on the field is by taking an action that would ordinarily acquire the field for you, because the wheat is like the field. And so even though I'm not actually selling you the field, by taking an action on the field, you're acquiring the wheat that's attached to the field, because something that's attached to the ground is like the ground. That's the Rashbam's approach. Let's take a look at the first Tosos, and we'll see a different approach. Lech v'yafel lecha karka kolshu tapra Tosos v'kani kol masha aleha kilomar hechzek b'karka al yedei yifoy. Take some kind of ownership of the land through your improvement. Dahavi ke'ein nal v'gadar, because it's like locking or gadar or breaking through, kolshu, some small amount. V'tehei she'ula lacha. And now the land, by taking that acquisition act, the land will be lent to you. Lihiyo kechatzercha, in order to be like your courtyard. Le'inyan zeh shetikne masha Allah. And through that, you will acquire what is on it. So Tosos has a different approach. Tosos's approach is saying, look, it's not about the acquisition of the land, acquiring the stuff that's attached to the land, but rather you end up becoming the borrowed owner of the land. And by being the borrowed owner of the land, you acquire what is on the land. And so as a result, we're not treating the stuff that is mechubar lakarka like land. So those are just two different ways of understanding this that I thought were interesting and worth highlighting. So that,
and he hasn't acquired the land according to Tosfos. He's just borrowing it.
Exactly. He's just borrowing it, but as the sort of borrower owner, because when you borrow something, it's as if you are become like the owner of the item during the time that you are the borrower. It's like he owns the field. And because it's like he owns the field, he can actually have that field take possession of something for him. Now, a clear nafkamina between these two approaches would be, what happens if a $20 bill happens to float onto the land? So according to Tosfos, the underlying land is being lent to you, and you are using it to acquire everything on the land. So that $20 bill belongs to you. On the other hand, according to the Rashbam, you are making an acquisition directly on the flax that is growing on the land, because it's considered attached to the land. You never become an owner at all of the land. And so as a result, that $20 bill that falls on the land continues to belong to the seller of the flax. So that's an interesting nafkamina potentially between these two approaches. Okay.
Did they got the $20? Who got the $20?
So it depends. If you hold like Tosfos, so then the buyer gets the $20. And if you hold like the Rashbam, then the seller gets the $20. Now, in our example, Stan was the seller and I was the buyer. So you can decide if, according to Tosfos, I'm the buyer, so I get it. And according to the Rashbam, Stan would get it. Okay.
Doesn't the
So that's
Rashbam also hold that he has chazaka in the land?
well,
Or just
no,
chazaka in the
wait,
Pishtan?
yeah, he makes a chazaka effectively on the Pishtan because the Pishtan is connected to land. So you never, that's the key point of the Rashbam, is that the land is never sold, never transferred. It would seem, according to the way I'm understanding the Rashbam.
So
Okay.
on what basis can he just walk in and take the Pishtan?
Because well, first of all, I gave permission. I told the buyer, sorry, Stan told me to come in, take a little bit of the Pishtan out of the land, which now improves the land because now Stan can plant something else in the location where I pulled the Pishtan out. And as a result, I've benefited Stan. And thereby made an acquisition in an aspect of the land. And the aspect of the land that Stan is allowing me to make an acquisition is the flax that is attached to the land. And that's the chiddush of the Mishnah. Whereas Toso says that, no, I'm making an acquisition in the land directly, that I'm borrowing the land, and through borrowing of the land, I'm acquiring the things that are on the land. Okay, so now the next Mishnah talks about liquids.
Do we know how much Pishtan he can take if the owner of the
It's
land says,
any
go
amount.
take
That's
this?
the amazing thing.
Can he take
Even
this
though
all the Pishtan in the field?
all the Pishtan that Stan is selling me that's attached to the ground, I buy all of it through just a removal of a little bit. That's precisely what the Mishnah was telling us. Excellent point. All right. Hamocher yayin v'shemen l'chaveiro. If you're selling wine and oil to your friend, v'hukru oshehuslu. Now, the first part of our Mishnah doesn't care that it's liquid, and it went up in value or down in value. Im ad shalonis mala hamida. If it was before the measuring cup got filled, lemocher. Well, then any price change is for the seller, meaning the seller still owns the item. And if it goes up, that's great for him. If it goes down, that's too bad for him. Mission is males hamida. But once the measuring cup gets filled, la lokeach. Now it's the buyer's. And so any change in price is for the buyer. The im hayasar b'neihen, and if there was a middleman between them, nishbara chavis, and the barrel broke, nishbara l'sarsor, then it broke for the middleman. So let's take a look at the Rashbam. Hayasarsor b'neihen, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 lines down, middle of the line in the Rashbam, of the widest lines at the bottom of the page. Hayasarsor b'neihen v'hamida shalo, and we're going to say that the measuring cup belongs to him. As the Gemara will explain.
To whom?
And the custom of middlemen, liknos mibalabayit. They buy it from the original owner, from the supplier. Umocher la'acherim. And they sell it to other people, umarviach, and they sell it for extra, and they get the profit. So that is who the sirsur is. And nishbur l'sirsur, and according to the Rashbam, now that the item broke, it was obviously his in the middle. The kanilei kelab, his vessels make an acquisition. Shall sirsur, l'sirsur, his vessels acquired it from the original owner. Kedetanya le'el, as we learned earlier, v'im haisa mida shel echad mehem, that if the measuring cup belongs to one of them, may rishon kana, it acquires for him as it gets filled. The kamash malan, and what this is coming to tell us, the lo amrinan, that we do not say the sursur enu ela shlucho, that the sursur shel lokeach, that the sursur is simply the messenger and agent of the buyer, because shenim ismalet nishbar lokeach. But if in fact it were to have already been full, so then it would be a loss for the buyer. Okay, so that's the Rashbam's approach. Namely,
who owns the measuring cup?
So the Gemara is going to ask that exact question to begin with, and in the end we're going to say that it belongs to a third party. So that's the answer to your question, but we'll see that that's going to be the question the Gemara is going to ask. Now, Tosos doesn't like the Rashbam's explanation. Perish HaKuntras, the Rashbam explains, Lefisha Asursur Kana La'atzmo, V'chozer Mocher L'Balabayas. And he, because the whole thing about the broken being a loss to the middleman is because he bought it from the seller and he's going to sell it to the buyer. Vitema, but this is a wonder. De'im Kane, Amai Nakat Nishbara. Why add a new topic and talk about the fact that the measuring item broke? The Shavak Yokra, Vishavak Yokra, and we leave aside Yokra Vizula, and we leave aside the fact that it went up in value or went down in value, Da'iri Baresha, that the beginning of our Mishnah talked about. Habilela Maimer, we should just say, Hayasur Beinehen, that if there was a middleman between them, v'hukra v'huzlo, and if it went up or down in value, so then it's the sursur's loss or benefit. Perish Rivam, and so therefore the Rivam offers the following. Haya sirsur beinehem, that the sirsur between them, the middleman between them, umadad lahen kedera sirsurim, shemodadim bischar, shenosim lahem. That the point is that at least at some point in history, there used to be people who would go around with their measuring cups and they would say, you can hire me. I'm a unbiased person and I'm an independent. You could trust my measuring cup and you pay me a little bit something and I'll measure for you. And he would never take ownership of the underlying goods. He would just be the measuring guy in the middle. And v'nishbara hachavis. And so now in that situation, if the barrel breaks al yedei medida through his measuring, nishbara l'sirsur, the middleman is responsible. And now the Tosos adds, and this is probably why the Rashbam doesn't like this explanation, the kagon shelo haya machvas onus. We have to say that we're not talking about something that was unavoidable. But Elak al yedei shelo nizhar yafa b'medida, that the sirsor is responsible because he wasn't very careful. Now, of course, in the Rashbam's explanation, we don't care about the liability, about the culpability of the middleman. It belonged to him, even if he's totally not culpable. Even if it was a lightning from heaven that broke the thing, he would be the loser.
So who's the winner, Rashbam?
Well, we have another machlokas between Tosos and Rashbam. I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure. Maybe next week we can see who the winner is. But the bottom line is, in this case, the middleman, at least in our facts, the middleman is the loser because it was either when he was measuring and he should have been more careful that the oil spilled, or the oil spilled when he owned it, and so as a result, he's the one who loses. So now
does Rashbam want to say that the sirsur actually bought the measuring vessel from the mocher?
No. The Rashbam says that the sirsur bought the contents of the vessel from the mocher. The sirsur is always using his own measuring cup. Okay, so now the Mishnah continues. This is why we're talking about liquids. When you pour out for a buyer, you need to let 3 drops drip. So after all of the flow is done, you have to wait 3 separate drips, and then you can end the transaction. Hirkina umitzis. Now, after Rashbam explains that after you've done that, you now turn up your the cup that you're using to pour, and some residue collects in the bottom of that cup. Harehu shel mocher. That belongs to the seller. But when you have a storekeeper, he doesn't have to wait 3 drops. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Erev Shabbos im chashecha patur. Rabbi Yehuda says no. It's only on Friday night that he's exempt. Now the question is what is he going on? Is he going on that no one is obligated to do 3 drops on Friday night? Or is he going on the storekeeper is only able to be exempt from the 3 drops on Friday night? That's going to be the question that the Gemara is going to ask. We will see that in a few moments. All right, so Hamida, with this measurement, Deman, who does it belong to? The Gemara wants to know. Or are we going to say that it belongs to the purchaser? Well, then there's a problem because Achalo Nismales Mida Lamocher, Mida Delokeach. Even when it is not filled, before it's filled, So then it belongs to the buyer, and the buyer should acquire each unit as it goes along. The elamida de moker. Also, you want to say maybe it's the mida, the measuring item of the measuring vessel of the seller. But mission ismala is mida lokeach, mida de mokerhi. Even when it's filled, it still belongs to the seller. So how can the buyer acquire any of it, even when it's done? So I'm Rabbi Yula b'midas sarsur. We're talking about a measuring cup that belongs to the middleman, measuring vessel that belongs to the middleman. Well, 1 second. How do you understand that the measuring cup belongs to the middleman? Because the Seifa introduced the Seifa of the Reisha part of the Mishnah. The second aspect of our Mishnah said, if there was a middleman between them, that if the barrel breaks, it broke for the middleman. That implies that the first case of our Mishnah is not talking about a middleman. So Reisha mida below sirsur. No, you're not misunderstanding me. When I say that it's a middleman, it's the measuring cup without an actual middleman being present. But Seifa b'sirsur atzmo, and the Seifa is dealing with the measuring man, the middleman actually being present and involved in the transaction. So, okay, so then we said, Hirkino mitzvahs harehu shel mocher, that when you tip it back over, anything that's left in the vessel belongs to the seller. But 1 second, Kisalik Rabbi Elazar, when Rabbi Elazar came from Bava to Eretz Yisrael, Ashkache leZeiri, he met Zeiri, Amarlai, Mikan Tana de Asnaye Rav Midos. Who is the one who taught whom Rav taught the law associating with measuring? Achve Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi. They pointed to Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi. So Amrlai, so he said to Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi said, "My kakashalach, what's your difficulty? What's your question?" De Tanan. Well, 1 second. Listen to this Mishnah. Herkina umitzis harehu shel mocher. That when you, which was our Mishnah, if you incline it back and it what's left, it belongs to the seller. But v'hatanan hirkina umitza harezu truma. If you are setting aside some olive oil for truma, then even what's left in the jar is still truma. So why is there a difference between truma, what you set aside for the Kohen, and a sale transaction where in the sale transaction the seller gets to keep it, but in the truma transaction the recipient gets to keep it. So Amarle, so Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi explained back to Rabbi Elazar, it marla. It was about this that it was said, Amar Rabbi Abahu, Mishum Yeyash Bailim Naguva, that the reason is not actually that the seller owns the remnants, but rather we're going to say that the buyer abandons the remnants. The buyer gives up hope on ever getting that little bit. He's okay. He waives his rights to it. But the problem is when it comes to Truma, there's nobody to waive the rights. Because even if you're one Kohen and you waive your rights to it, I would need every other Kohen to waive his rights to it. So as a result, in the Truma situation, there can't be a waiver of rights. And so as a result, and even if you did waive your rights, it's still Truma, and therefore a Zar, a non-Kohen, is not allowed to eat it. So therefore, that's why these two laws have different results. Okay, and now we get to the statement of Rabbi Yehuda, who said that it only applies on Erev Shabbos. So Ibailahu, Rabbi Yehuda Reisha Kai Ulakula was Rabbi Yehuda's statement on the rule of requiring 3 drops, and he was being lenient and saying that even though an ordinary sale transaction requires that you wait 3 drops, if it's Erev Shabbos right before Shabbos, so then you don't have to worry about it. I guess that's a Daf Yomi coincidence because today's Erev Shabbos. And so therefore he's being lenient. Odilma aseva kayu l'chumra. Or maybe he's saying that a chenveni who doesn't have to require the 3 drops. It is only on Friday that he doesn't have to require the 3 drops. And so as a result, he's stricter than the Tanakama. So Tashma, Titania, we've got a brisa. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Erev Shabbos Imcha Shecha, when it's Friday near the end of the day, Chenveni Patur, that it's the storekeeper is exempt, meaning because the Chenveni is very busy on Fridays and we need to give him the ability to do other transactions. And so as a result, he does not need to wait. But on other times, even a Chenveni would need to wait, according to Rabbi Yehuda. That brings us to the next Mishnah. And the next Mishnah says, Hashalech has been no eitzel Chenveni. So you send your son to a storekeeper, and this is talking about a Chenveni who's a minor. Upundiyan biyado. And even though it's in parentheses, we should read this. It's you give him a coin, a pundian. A pundian is worth 2 isar. That's the important fact about the pundian. Umadad lo be'isar shemen. And so now the storekeeper measures out an isar worth of oil, v'nasan lo esa isar, and he gives the child an isar of change. Right, the guy brought $1, and the storekeeper and the child brought $1, and the storekeeper gave him 50 cents of oil and 50 cents of change. Shavar as a slochis. Now the flask of oil broke. The ibid as a isar, and the child lost the change. Chenveni chayev. Wow, the storekeeper is liable. Rabbi Yehuda Poter. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, the storekeeper is not liable. Sha'al manaskein shulcho. The father knew what he was doing. He sent the child in order to bring home the oil and the change. Umodim chachamim Rabbi Yehuda, and the chachamim agree with Rabbi Yehuda, meaning the Tanakama agrees with Rabbi Yehuda. Bisman shad sloches biyad atino, when the flask is in the child's hands. Umada chenveni letocha, and the storekeeper measures the oil into it. Shechenveni pater. In that situation, the chenveni is pater. Now, Rashbam explains that the chenveni is pater only when it comes to the flask. He is not pater, according to the Chachamim, when it comes to the oil and the change. That he would still be liable for. So what's the explanation? So Bishlama, it's all fundamental on the first part. Bishlama be'isar v'shemen.
But he lost the coin independent of the broken flask, right?
He did both. Yes, he was a very irresponsible child. But again, he's a child.
So why would we say that the Chenveni is responsible for the change?
Because he gave it to a child. You don't give something to a child. So bishlama be'isar v'shemen b'hapligi. So when it comes to the isar and the oil, here's the disagreement. The Rabbanan savri la'aduye shadrei. The rabbis say that why did you send your minor child to the store? It was only to inform the shopkeeper of your order. You weren't expecting the shopkeeper to send back the stuff with your child. And Savar and Rabbi Yehuda Savar, and Rabbi Yehuda thinks l'shture le'shtadre. No, of course you sent him to come back with the stuff. Now, in the end, we paskin like the rabbis. However, it's important to note that everything is based on custom, and as a result, modern poskim have actually ruled that in today's world, where it is customary to send a 10 or 11-year-old, especially in Israel, to go and get something from the shop. Again, as long as the shopkeeper doesn't act in an irresponsible manner, we're going to say that the father took on the liability associated.
What kind of shopping?
Buy a jug of milk. Okay. You would send us an 11-year-old to go get some milk.
Yeah,
so
supermarket.
Exactly, at a supermarket. Elot slochus. But 1 second. So now the Gemara is explaining. But what about that flask? That's what we're going to ask. Why is the Chenveni chayev to pay for it? Aveda midasi, especially at the end of our Mishnah. Why should he ever be? Why should why should he ever be responsible? We're always assuming that the father gave his child a flask, and so as a result, it's like he gave up hope on it. It's like he recognized that it was going to get destroyed. So we're going to have 4 attempts to explain the situation in our Mishnah that would help us understand why there's this difference in the beginning of the Mishnah that the rabbis say that the chenveni is responsible for the flask, and then in our and in the end of the Mishnah we're going to say that the chenveni, the storekeeper, is not responsible. So we're going to take a look at two of the explanations today, and we'll do the other two tomorrow. So Amar of Hoshaya, Hakababal Habayas Mocher Slochas Askina. That when we're dealing with a father, the father is a seller of flasks. And the father is trying to sell the flask to the storekeeper. And the rabbis hold like Shmuel. If you take something from a shopkeeper in order to look at it, and something bad happens, and it just like breaks in your hands, chayiv, right? You touched it, you break it, you take it, or whatever the rule is, right? You break it, you buy it. You know the point, yeah, exactly. So the point is that's what Shmuel says. But 1 second, if the machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda is all about Shmuel, lema de Shmuel Tanaihi, are you going to tell me that Shmuel's ruling is subject to a Tanaic debate? That doesn't make any sense. Shmuel is not going to say his ruling and contradict half of our Mishnah. So we're going to try and offer an alternative explanation. So effort number 2. Ella Rabba Rav Yosef Darmi Tarvayu, they explain the situation as we're talking about a storekeeper who sells flasks. The Rabbi Yehuda l'taimei, and Rabbi Yehuda follows his own reasoning. The Rabbanan l'taimayu, and the rabbis follow their reasoning. Well, 1 second. Ihachi ema seifa. But in the end, why is the seifa different? Modim chachamim l'Rebbe Yehuda bizman shad slochis biyad hatino umadad chenveni l'tocha shechenveni pator v'ha'amrat la'aduya shadrei. But if you're going to tell me that the father only sent the child to the storekeeper to inform the storekeeper of the order, then why should the fact that the flask is in the child's hand when the storekeeper measures the oil into it, why should that make a difference at the end of the day? And so as a result, we have rejected effort number 2 to explain our Mishnah. So for efforts number 3 and 4, you'll need to stay tuned. My apologies for not scrolling. I'll scroll now. For efforts number 3 and 4 to our explanation of our Mishnah, you'll need to stay tuned for tomorrow's.
Why do we have to bring in the concepts that either the father or the chenveni are owners of flask or merchants of flask? We're talking about purchasing oil from the chenveni.
Yes, but the flask, but the Mishnah said that the Chachamim said that the chenveni is also responsible and liable for the broken flask. So the question is why does the Tanakama / Chachamim say that they're responsible for the broken flask, and Rabbi Yehuda say that you're not responsible for the broken flask? And why do the Chachamim change only based on whether the child is holding the oil, child is holding the flask, and the storekeeper is measuring the oil into the flask? Why is that sufficient to change the viewpoint of the Tanakama to say now all of a sudden that it's not it's not the storekeeper's liability, and instead it's the father's loss that the flask broke in that situation. So that's the question: is what is our Mishnah talking about? How are we going to understand this Mishnah to say we have a machlokas in one situation, and then if the child is holding the flask and the storekeeper pours oil into it, we have a different result, and the different result is only different with respect to the liability of the flask. With respect to the liability for the oil and the money and the change, the Chachamim will still say that the storekeeper is liable for the oil and the change. So why? What's the facts of the situation? So the effort number one said that the father was a seller of flasks, and so as a result, when the storekeeper looked at the flask, he became liable. But the problem is we're assuming that the factual situation in the beginning and the end are the same. So what's the difference? And then I'm sorry, if the storekeeper looked at the flask, then we have, I'm sorry, the problem is then Rabbi Yehuda would be disagreeing with Shmuel, and Shmuel wouldn't have made a statement that would have Rabbi Yehuda necessarily disagree with him, because then that would be the subject of the machlokas, and he wouldn't have phrased it that way. He would have just said that the halacha is like the Tanakama, if that's what he thought. So that didn't work with the seller of the flask being the father. And then we said, okay, so maybe the seller of the flask is the storekeeper. But the problem is if the storekeeper is giving the flask to the child, what does it make a difference whether the storekeeper filled the flask and then gave it to the child, or gave it to the child and then filled the flask? So both of those situations, the liability should be the same. And yet the Chachamim differentiate between those two situations. So
I don't know. I don't see how we're making a differentiation. We're bringing.
Well, the Chachamim at the end
trying
say
to
that they agree with Rabbi Yehuda that if the storekeeper measured the oil into the flask held by the child, then the storekeeper is exempt from liability with respect to the flask. Why?
Because the child is holding it?
Yes, why does that make a difference? Why does the child holding it? Why, if I gave a full flask to the child, do the rabbi say that the storekeeper is liable? But if I gave an empty flask to the child and then I poured into it the oil, then now I'm not liable for it. That doesn't make any sense. There's no difference between giving the storekeeper giving the child a full flask or giving the child an empty flask and then pouring the oil in. There was no difference in those two situations.
I don't see where the Gemara even mentioned that differentiation. I mean,
it's the Mishnah. It's the Mishnah, Ken.
Okay.
The Mishnah said that in the Tanakama said that the storekeeper is liable for the money, for the oil, and for the flask. Rabbi Yehuda says the storekeeper is not liable for anything, because the storekeeper, the father sent the child to do all the things.
No, I see that's the Mishnah, but the distinction you're making now between whether the store owner filled an empty flask and gave it to the child, or whether the child was holding the flask and then the
that's how the second explanation
sort of then filled it. I don't see that in the Mishnah or the Gemara.
No, so that's the Gemara says, Rabba and Rav Yosef says that we're dealing with a storekeeper who sells flasks. So that means that the flask is coming from the storekeeper. Okay? So the flask did not come with from the father to the child to the storekeeper. The storekeeper is the supplier of the flask. And so as a result, in the beginning part of our Mishnah, now we need to understand what is our Mishnah case, because the second case in our Mishnah says that if the flask is held by the child and the storekeeper measures the oil into it, the storekeeper is exempt from liability according to the Chachamim for the flask. So what's the situation in the beginning of our Mishnah? According to this explanation of Rabbah and Rav Yosef, and how does it differ from the end of our Mishnah? So if the storekeeper is the supplier of the flask, the only possible difference between the second case of our Mishnah and the first case of our Mishnah is that the storekeeper filled the flask before giving it to the child.
No, not necessarily.
So give me another explanation.
No,
tell me what the ratio of the Mishnah is talking about.
Not necessarily, because the storekeeper could give the flask to the child, and the child is holding the flask while the storekeeper fills it. It doesn't mean
that's explicitly what the Seifa of the Mishnah talks about. The Seifa of the Mishnah says that's exactly the case, right? Let's take a look at the wording of the Mishnah itself, right? The Mishnah itself said, right? Umodim chachamim l'Rebbe Yehuda. When the flask was in the child's hand, and now the storekeeper measured into it, that's where the Chachamim say that the storekeeper is exempt. So you can't say that that's the case in the beginning of our Mishnah. That can't be the case. That's the case of the end of the Mishnah. So what's the case of the beginning of the Mishnah if the storekeeper is the supplier of the flask? If the storekeeper is the supplier of the flask, it must be that the storekeeper filled the flask while he was holding it and gave a full flask to the child. But that shouldn't be enough of a reason to distinguish between whether or not the storekeeper is liable for the flask.
I'm hearing what you're trying to dissect the Mishnah here, but it still doesn't prove that the storekeeper did not give his own flask to the child to hold while the child was filling it. That could still be the case, even in the beginning.
It can't be
in
the case.
Ratio.
It can't be the case in the ratio. Because
no,
what's the difference between the ratio and the seifa?
It doesn't matter who owns it. It doesn't matter. In either case,
all right, I'm going to hold on. Ken, what's the difference between the seifa and the ratio? If both the ratio and the seifa deal with the storekeeper giving the flask to the child and filling the flask while it's being held by the child, what's the difference between the ratio and the seifa that you're saying that in the ratio the storekeeper is liable for the flask, and in the seifa the storekeeper is not liable for the flask? What's the difference?
You have the ratio that the storekeeper is liable.
Yes, that's what the Tanakama says.
Right. Okay.
Right?
So if the storekeeper is liable for so he could be holding the flask, let's say, while he pours it. It doesn't mean that he could be pouring but it could be his, but it could be the child brought the flask to the storekeeper.
But the storekeeper is, no, that doesn't work, because Rabba and Rav Yosef say that the storekeeper is the one who sells the flasks, right? It's not clear in our Mishnah who's bringing the flask to whom. In the ratio, in the first explanation of Rav Hoshea, it's the child who brings the flask to the store. In the seifa, in the explanation of Rabba and Rav Yosef, now the storekeeper is selling the flask. So the flask did not come with the child to the store. The storekeeper is giving the child the flask.
Okay, so that's their interpretation. That's the way they're 100%. Trying to understand the Mishnah. But one could still say that if you listen, one could still say that either one could have owned the flask in either case, and the store owner either was holding the child's flask in the ratio, or vice versa in the sefer, that the chedveni was holding his flask and pouring it from the child's flask and pouring it in the. Either way, you could say the opposite case. Rav and Rav Yosef are holding one opinion, but you could see it the other way, that it doesn't necessarily have to be the ownership. They're trying to define an ownership. It doesn't have to be that way.
Well, of course it doesn't have to be that way, and indeed we're rejecting their explanation. We're going to end up with 4 different explanations of what of how we can define the Mishnah. The first,
I could see this as saying that the child in one case the child brings his flask and the store owner fills it, or that the store owner fills the child's flask, and gives it to the child, or the child, you could look at it on either side, the ratio, the safer that.
Okay, I don't think we're getting anywhere. The bottom line is that unless you can give me an explanation for why the Chachamim have a difference, and that when the only change is the fact that all that we know in the Seifa that we didn't have in the Reisha is that the flask is being filled by the storekeeper while it's being held by the child. All of a sudden now, there's no liability for the storekeeper for the flask. So what's the story in the Reisha? What's the story in the Seifa? That allows for the change being only the fact that in the Seifa, the child is holding the flask, and in the Reisha, something else is happening. You're right. We don't know what's exactly happening. According to Rabbi and Rav Yosef, it seems pretty clear to me that it's the storekeeper who's holding the flask while it's being filled. And so as a result, that is not enough of a difference to make.
But for instance, in the Sefer, if the child is holding the flask, it could be.
Yes, of course, the child's holding the flask, 100%. So what?
So it could be that the flask is the store owner's. It could be the flask is the child's flask, the father's flask. And
Correct.
in either case, the child drops the flask. So he or his father are responsible, not the store owner. But doesn't have to be that the flask is owned by either one. I mean, it's owned by either one of them, but we don't know who owns it. And Rav and Rav Yosef are supposing they're taking one opinion, and it's owned in this case by the child. But it doesn't have to be that way.
100%, Ken.
It doesn't
If
have
what
to
you're
be.
saying, if what you're saying is that it doesn't have to be the situation that's described of Rabba and Rav Yosef, of course that's the point. We're going to have two more that we haven't even dealt with. So to stay tuned for those two more, as we'll deal with them tomorrow. All right. Have a great day. Have a great Shabbos. Thanks so much.